thank you so much, Keely and Francesca, for organising this event, and it's great to see many of you this morning. And thank you, and I know that Keely's doing some fantastic work at LSE around the decolonising agenda. And so, as she's explained, I support staff in developing more inclusive teaching and learning practices. And my work is quite challenging. It's fraught with resistance, as you can imagine, and it's difficult at times to persuade and support staff to develop different teaching and learning practices, shall we say. But it's not all negative, and I work with some fantastic staff who are working really hard to transform their curriculum and practices. And I'm really acutely aware that the landscape's changed significantly since I stopped teaching undergraduate students. And I think there are lots of competing demands on academic workloads, balancing research versus developing teaching and curriculum. And of course, the NSS is a real factor in terms of any risk taking in this arena, and so it's a challenging situation, and I understand the competing demands. And so, just to give you a bit of background, that I'm not a historian, but my practice is very much around the development of decoloniality praxis rather than theorising about decolonising, and this was part of a study which examined academic resistance, and it was conducted 2 years ago, and arguably knowledge has probably moved on significantly since then. And after this project, the Royal Historical Society briefing came out. So that was an additional catalyst to moving some of this work forward, which was really positive. So this is a work in progress paper, and just to say, I spent some significant time within the department supporting staff on developing curricula, not just decolonising, but developing inclusive practices and trying to embed equality and diversity considerations. And this came about from a number of students of colour who complained about not feeling that they saw themselves within the space in the curriculum, and they were feeling marginalised in the classroom. And so there was lots of conversations that took place, and lots of work to get to a starting point to focus on curriculum development. So by all means, it wasn't an easy task, and it takes time and it's labour intensive. So what I'd like to talk about this morning is just very briefly consider the current terrain around the decolonising agenda, thinking about the positioning of the academic within the educational triad, and how students and academics resistance is enacted within some of this work. It is under-researched within the UK, and so in my work I looked at Lynn Quinn's theory of academic resistance as a theoretical framework to analyse some of my data, which was mainly from questionnaire and focus group findings. So I hope that's okay. So, since the Why is My Curriculum White University College London campaign in 2015, which openly criticised history, philosophy and politics as subjects which reinforced whiteness, which compromise of white ideas and white authors, this has normalised whiteness and made blackness invisible, and this was key to the campaign. And there's been a surge of conferences, blogs, academic publications in the UK about the decolonising curriculum agenda. Students are very much now quite vocal about contesting how their identities are not visible within the curriculum. And there is also pressing concern in secondary and history education, which needs to be radically overhauled and decolonised. And arguably, the student voice has been a real driving force in furthering this agenda. And following on from the terrible incidents in Minnesota, we've seen a huge growth in the Black Lives Matter movement, with demonstrations, toppling of statues, petitions and letters from student unions holding universities to account to commit to advancing race equality and really pushing for change for decolonising activities. And we've also seen universities bravely responding with an equally interesting set of promises. And whilst the student voice is essential and there is an absence in the academic voice in this work, and most recently has been an emerging body of research which suggests that decolonising is an ambiguous term and it's contested and criticised by many, often seen as a buzzword. Coupled with debates around practitioners' interest or lack of engagement in the decolonising agenda, often academics are sceptical and lack the knowledge and understanding of what decolonisation entails, let alone exercising it in their subjects. Meda et al. 2019. So whilst lecturers are asked to decolonise curriculum, there is little agreement as to whether they're equipped for such a task. Not to mention the lack of focus on decolonial praxis, which is rarely acknowledged in institutional curriculum design policies, academic frameworks. And so there's limited guidance to support such endeavours, especially from an academic developer's position. So what do we mean by decolonising very quickly, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. But I just wanted to talk from looking at Doherty et al.'s paper around decoloniality, which urges us to consider ways in which colonialism has shaped and how coloniality continues to shape knowledge production and educational systems. And in this sense, therefore, the decolonising movement has the potential to engender a radical framework for examining and transforming the colonial relations that shape education. And really, decolonising the curriculum benefits all students and not just students of colour. And I think it's important that that is framed, because later on we talk about some of the students' resistance and resentment towards focus on other groups within this type of work. So I didn't realise this picture was flashing so much, so I do apologise. So when we think about the academic triad in Soloshny Vendeya's 2019 paper, Why Decolonising the South African University Curriculum Will Fail, the paper explores the educational triad, so the three key players within this process. And that comprises of the academic, the student or the learner, and the curriculum content, which unfolds within historical, political, and social and educational context. So it is context specific, and arguably is it disciplinary specific as well. And so we see lots of universities undertaking decolonial activity, but this is enacted very differently in different universities and different spaces. So changing one aspect of this triad without due consideration of others will not affect the desired change, and changing the curriculum alone will not work in the context of the university. And the demographics of the learner has radically changed a massive drive to decolonise the curriculum. And it's initiated a challenge raised by students primarily during protest actions. However, students often remark that they are being taught in oppressive classrooms by academics who are demeaning, unprofessional, and use their powers in ways that discriminate unfairly against students. So it's not just the curriculum content, it's around the pedagogy, it's around that compassionate pedagogy that needs to be applied to the curriculum content, and around culturally responsive pedagogy and inclusive assessment practices that go hand in hand in this work, which is sometimes challenging to reinforce all together. So how this is undertaken is using academics that can become agents of meaningful social change. However, academics are not merely conduits of the curriculum, and they're complex. They're complex beings, constituted amongst other things as identity, value, beliefs, systems and lived experiences, all of which inform their practice within particular contexts. And I often see that within my work as an academic developer. I teach new academics who start at the university, and we start off some of our programs on unpacking their teaching philosophy, and we ask staff how their teaching is shaped, who's influenced their values and beliefs, and it's quite interesting to see that tension on how they were taught and what their educational experiences were versus the demands of meeting the diverse needs of the student population now. And so there's a real tension, and I sometimes hear, well, when I was taught, when I went to university, and there's a real tension there. And so beliefs and values are quite difficult to change, and fundamentally changing mindsets to move away from Eurocentric practices is a big undertaking. Not only that, the debates around the decolonising curriculum centre around stifling academic freedom. Individuals are often defensive around the use of the term, which I saw in my research, and the focus on one specific identity is a real contention for some academics. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how that's now visible within research and how it was within my study. But what I wanted to think about is the sort of evidence around the student resistance. And whilst decolonising curriculum resistance initiatives is limited in the UK, there is a wealth of student resistance towards engaging in diversity and race topics, which is well documented. And as such, this can be both implicit and explicit, including a range of displays such as hostile silence, challenges to instructor authority and intellectual ability, claims of reverse racism and denial of existence of privilege and racial bias, and an assertion of colourblind ideology, which I've experienced many a times in practice, especially when I deliver sessions on white privilege. Often students centre their own identity and beliefs and consider academics of colour furthering their own agenda. And decolonising the curriculum, student resistance was demonstrated in a study, Hendrick and Young in 2017, who were attempting to decolonise and deliver a module in social work. And they found students were often very resistant to learning about Aboriginal culture. And many students questioned why they needed to know about Aboriginal affairs, often accompanied with a statement, "I'm not going to work with Aboriginal people, so I don't need to know this." And Australia is a multicultural society. Why focus on Aboriginal people? And the lecturers had to challenge those perceptions, not only for students, but for staff in terms of the content of the curriculum. And again, I see very similar incidents in my previous practice. I was an initial teacher educator in the north of England, and I taught equality and diversity module to primary trainee teachers. And I distinctly remember a specific session on supporting English as an additional language learners, and 2 students said that they didn't need to learn this because they wanted to work in Ilkley and Harrogate, which are quite affluent, predominantly white areas in the north of England. And they were adamant that schools they would work in would not include pupils from diverse backgrounds. And they switched off during the session and continually looked at their mobile phones and challenged me throughout the module. And so the study was really interesting in terms of how there was a need for unlearning and questioning what we know and how we know and what we know, to further relearning towards unsettling patriarchal and colonial take-up for granted systems. So I thought it was important to situate that grappling and resistance and tension that often happens in the classroom, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. So thinking now and moving towards the patterns of resistance towards academics and around curriculum development. And whilst I explained earlier there's a lack of evidence around academic resistance towards decolonising the curriculum, there is a wealth of resistance in managing change, and this was an important focus in my paper, and it's cited in a wealth of literature. And patterns of resistance in managing assessment change was reported in a study by Deneen and Boud in 2014, and this is about the pushback reported in practice against changing of assessment regimes. And managing change in any kind of higher education setting is challenging, and change is difficult to model and initiate and sustain, and that's by Paul Trower and Murray Saunders in 2003. And resistance is enacted and manifested in a number of ways, such as a reinterpretation of policy to hamper change attempts, refusal to actuate change, and an open rejection of premises and plans. And we often see that in terms of any curriculum assessment or teaching and learning change that's introduced wholesale to departments or individual staff groups. And it requires a willingness to rethink and replan conventional approaches, and again that's quite difficult, especially if you've been ingrained and you've studied and worked within a Eurocentric white system, and so teaching staff may not perceive a need to change with what they're unfamiliar with or they're not comfortable, and many resist if they perceive that a proposed change is an attempt to limit academic freedom or disempower them. And again, we see that in the research that I'll discuss later on. So I hope that makes sense so far in terms of how we identify academic resistance. I'm going to move on now to the framework that I used in my study. So Linquin's theoretical framework on understanding resistance towards staff development was a discourse analysis study on categorising academic staff development and learning, and the research identified 4 categories around resistance in teaching and learning towards staff development. And these are categorised as disciplinary, student deficit, skills required or lack of skills, and performativity. So I'll just quickly go through them, and then I'll talk about the research findings and how that applied to this particular framework. So thinking about how the disciplinary pushback was around how prioritising research and the acquisition of knowledge over teaching, for some staff, there was an assumption that good research automatically led to good teaching and good curriculum content, and that because their research profiles were incredibly strong, this was not necessary, and undertaking this work was detracting from their academic identity as such. And academics also argued that their subject and disciplinary knowledge was a precedent that was often set within the organisational culture and ethos.
Yeah.
Sorry. So disciplinary resistance can be found when academics suggest that the decolonial agenda does not apply to their subject. For example, debates on history versus science, and suggestions that came from the research was medieval history cannot be decolonised, and this only applies to modern history. So there was that intention as well within the history discipline that came out within the study. So moving on now to student deficit, and this assumes that teaching and learning deficiencies were as a direct result of ill-prepared students being ill-prepared to study at university, or that they were the wrong students at the university. And I led that to be code in terms of the lack of awareness or support for the widening participation agenda, and that the decolonising curriculum would marginalise other groups of students, and of course many history departments are dominated by white middle class students, and therefore it was perceived as decolonising would perhaps be unnecessary. And when I identified with Quinn's discourse framework around the skills deficit, was that there was an understanding that teaching and learning did not require any training or ongoing professional development. And there were notions to suggest that teaching is devalued, and what really counts is the research, which is especially true in some universities. And I saw the similarities and differences from my study in comparison to Quinn's findings. And what really came out of the research was the skills gap and knowledge to reform the curriculum. And a number of participants were open and honest about not being equipped to revise learning outcomes and content. So that was really clear from the research. And the final discourse of performativity is based on assumptions around focusing on quality assurance and suggestions that any development which is centred on teaching and learning is merely strategic or practical requirement, and academics often review this as compliance to meeting minimum requirements. And there was also a tension between the regulations and academic code of practice and the time taken to enact any curriculum reform, and that was often seen as a barrier, but it was arguably an excuse to undertake further transformative curriculum development. So we saw quite a lot of discussion around the QA regulations being a barrier to the work. So I think these categories are really useful for identifying other types of resistance within curriculum development. So moving on now to the findings. So as I explained earlier, this was collected by questionnaires and focus groups, and it was conducted in one department, and it was quite a small department, but over 87% of staff participated in the project, and over a third responses were in favour of decolonising the curriculum. An additional 35% were not, and 20% of responses were neutral. So some people were quite passive. They didn't really engage in the questions. So resistance was voiced in a number of responses, and concerning disciplinary resistance, identified in Quinn's research, and participants positioned their in-depth knowledge of the discipline, and that was complementary to good teaching. And our own reforms to teaching have tended to impose a model that works well for British modern history. And this respondent suggested that there wasn't any need to look at their particular modules, and that the reforms were unnecessary, and that the content around British modern history was sufficiently diverse and decolonised, and there wasn't a need to interrogate or investigate further in this particular case. And whilst there was an assumption that the topic itself does not mean that decolonising work is complete, and the questioning of Western knowledge and dominance was absent from this particular module. Many modules are white, Eurocentric in their themes and underlying assumptions. So this is a contrasting participant. However, additional responses clearly demonstrate an awareness of the disciplinary issues and lack of concerns around decolonising and equality and diversity. And as a discipline, the subject lends itself to confronting issues directly around race, class and gender. And again, there was this middle ground where a group of academics were very clear that this work needed to take place, and then there was a third who felt that it wasn't necessary. And so I think that there are a lot of colleagues that are probably made uncomfortable with the word decolonising, and that perhaps they're latching onto it and seeing that it's related to identity politics. And that's something that's perhaps seen as a faddish. And this was an additional comment on the political agenda underpinning the project. The decolonising agenda is, however, the political agenda of the radical left. And this is also echoed in Shulman's discussion on decolonising the curriculum, where academics often criticise the enforcing of identity politics. And further resistance to decolonising history curriculum was voiced by one participant. The pressure that we are receiving, especially from outside the department, to standardise our teaching threatens to wipe out little diversity we've already achieved. And this is seen in similar studies in attempts to embed equality and diversity focuses. Staff expressed resistance as we already do this and suspected that I was interfering within their disciplinary area. We know what's best for our subject and our discipline. And I was acutely aware of being the outsider and perhaps not having enough weight or credibility because I worked within a different department and I was not a historian, nor did I have a PhD, and therefore there was also this idea of not feeling that I had the authority to interfere in any of this activity. So we saw that there was this undermining of the activity, and that we know what's best for our subject. And what's really interesting is this second quote around how a participant suggested that this would create tension between 52% of the students who voted in favour of Brexit, and would this emphasise or endanger part of our recruitment, as they were acutely aware that the vast majority of students within the department were white, and they have made this assumption that they voted Brexit. I'm not sure where this evidence came from. And so such issues suggest a resistance to diversifying the curriculum in fear of upsetting some students who may not welcome some changes. And this was irrespective of the right, moral, social justice concerns for decolonising the curriculum. And arguably this can be seen and viewed in parallel with Quinn's discourse of resistance around the student deficit, and there was a blaming of the student voice as such. And then we see some really incredible vocal voices pushing for change, and it was absolutely imperative that history changes. It's Eurocentric perspective, and this is not what the student wants, and we want to hear from those I teach and those that come from open days. We need to open up to the rest of Europe, and this would bring us up to speed on the rapidly changing landscape of history teaching in the world today. And so they were aware that perhaps they were not cutting edge within this agenda, and that there was a need to really upscale and become more competitive. And that was often discussed around who were their competitors, what was happening in different universities, which was quite interesting. So other responses suggested that terms needed clarification and that language should be clearer and definition should help. And an additional survey respondents was really against the use of decolonise, and this equates to the history of invasion, of violent domination and exploitation, and the history of colonialism with the design of a history curriculum. These two are not remotely comparable, and it trivialises the history to use this kind of language. And there was a suggestion that such language was sanitising the curriculum, and that we should not be engaged in a programme of sanitising our curriculum, let alone one that fixes a kind of racialised or gendered thinking, which assumes that students can only learn from those which they might be thought on the basis of skin colour or gender and identity. So concluding and finally around the positive responses towards the plan change, I welcome initiatives that have begun and can see that we should do more to decolonise the history curriculum. And whilst a further respondent suggested that the organisation, culture and ethos of the department needed to change before any meaningful curriculum development could take place. So without addressing the prejudice and the xenophobia that structure all decision making in this department, little real progress will be made on diversity matters. And so there was tensions within the department and around the values that was underpinning some of these decisions. And you could see the pushback which was exhibited in some of the earlier suggestions for decolonising the curriculum, which was met with real resistance. And so there was a number of suggestions that the commitment or the interest from senior manager was tokenistic and often piecemeal. With our own senior management, the commitment to diversifying the curriculum and equality and diversity is around statistics and minimum requirements. Other comments suggestion that the commitment was disingenuous, and I think that people paid lip service to it, and they'll say we prioritise it, but we actually don't see anything happening. And if there is commitment on one level, I think there has to be wholesale commitment. And so with our own senior management, for example, that commitment needs to be holistic and seen through, which works over the minimum, often quite arbitrary standards. And so just finally, the additional suggestions around wider institutional support, strategising from senior management and a stronger steer to the subject area, which oversees resourcing and recruitment, publicly and research activities, and having a change management approach. And of course, there are many change management theories out there, but you need institutional support, you need student support, and you need pro-vice chancellor support, as well as the academics who need to be within this agenda. So there was a real need for it to be recognised within the whole of the university rather than just on a micro level within the history department. So these are very brief snapshot findings to the study. So I hope that some of that made sense. And finally, just to finish off about how the academics were very honest and open about tackling these issues. And a number of academics discussed a lack of space and time that are needed to develop decolonising culturally responsive curriculum. And suggestions included a strategic approach with more focus on developing policy and practice. And it is a political and deeply personal issue, and I think there needs to be further research on the academic resistance towards such endeavours. This is only a small case study, and by all means there are parallels to other research, but we need to really know more about what are the issues and understanding the identities of academics who are really key players within this agenda. So I hope that was okay. So I have some questions, and I don't know anybody else wants to say anything in terms of how resistance is perhaps enacted in your departments or within your institution, and did you see any parallels within this research?
Just to say thank you, Danielle, that was brilliant. Really, some real powerful conversations to be had, actually, so thank you very much.